"You should be grateful I stayed this long with you," she said before leaving me for someone else. I didn't argue. Months later, she was the one posting sad quotes while watching my life improve without her being part of it. "You should be grateful I stayed this long with you." That was it. No build-up. No argument that spiraled toward it. Just those 10 words, standing in the kitchen at 9 on a Tuesday night, her arms crossed over her chest, her voice carrying the flat, practiced calmness of someone who had already rehearsed this moment at least a dozen times before deciding to finally perform it. I didn't say anything back. Not because I had nothing to say. Not because she was right. Not because I was too broken to respond. I stayed quiet because somewhere underneath the fluorescent hum of the kitchen light, something in me had already gone very still, like a clock that had been winding down for a long time and had finally just stopped. She took my silence as surrender. She always did. I didn't understand then. Couldn't have. But that sentence was the first line of a last chapter one hadn't known we were already in. And the ending of that chapter? She didn't get to write it the way she thought she would. I want you to understand something before I keep going. This isn't a story about anger. I'm not going to spend the next several minutes fueling something toxic just to get your reaction. This is a story about what happens when you quietly let yourself disappear inside someone else's version of who you should be. And then one day, for no single dramatic reason, you just stop. You just stop. And the world doesn't end. And the silence that follows isn't frightening. It's actually the first silence in years that doesn't feel like it's warning you about something. But before all of that, before the mornings that finally felt like mine, before the work that actually reflected what I was capable of, before the life I didn't even know I was capable of building, there was her. And there were 4 years. And the thing about 4 years is that they don't feel like 4 years while you're inside them. They feel like Tuesday. They feel like next weekend. They feel like something you'll sort out soon. And then you look up and realize soon has been happening for a very long time. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I was 26 when we got together. She was 25. We met through mutual friends at a weekend thing, a house gathering, the kind where someone brings too much wine and the music is always slightly too loud to have a real conversation, but everyone pretends they're having one anyway. She was sharp. That was the first thing I noticed. Not just smart, sharp. The kind of person who catches the exact thing someone was trying to say beneath what they actually said and calls it out with a look before they've even finished the sentence. I thought that was something rare. I wanted to be seen by someone like that. I thought I was. For a while, I think I genuinely was. We were together for 8 months before we got serious enough to stop pretending we weren't. We moved in together at the 14-month mark, into a flat I'd been renting alone for 2 years, 2 bedrooms, 3rd floor, big kitchen window that got the afternoon sun in summer. I remember the weekend we moved her things in. We'd borrowed a friend's van and made 3 trips, and by the evening we were exhausted and sitting on the floor eating noodles from the containers because neither of us could be bothered to find which box the bowls were in. She'd laughed at something I said. I can't even remember what, and I thought, this is it. This is the thing. And it was. For a while, I thought that was us choosing each other in the permanent-sounding way. I thought moving your bookshelves into someone's space and rearranging the kitchen to make room for their things meant something irreversible. And I suppose it did, just not in the way I meant. The first year was good. Not a perfect relationship from a film good. Just genuinely, sustainably good in the way that matters more. We cooked together on Sunday afternoons and made a mess of it and didn't care. We drove without a destination sometimes, just picked a direction and went until something looked interesting. She used to leave notes in my jacket pockets, folded into small squares. A sentence or two. Thinking about you today. You made me laugh 3 times before 9 a.m. That has to be a record. Still my favorite person. Don't tell anyone. I kept them. Every single one. Folded up small in the back of a drawer in the bedroom that I never really organized. I'm telling you about the notes now because I need you to know there was something real there at the beginning. I didn't spend 4 years holding on to an illusion I invented. There was something real. And the tragedy, if there is one, isn't that I loved someone who never cared. The tragedy is that something real can quietly become something else while you're not looking. And by the time you recognize what it's become, you've already spent years building your sense of self around the version that no longer exists. The shift didn't arrive with a moment. It crept in the way cold does when you're already inside, not in one blast, but in degrees. So gradual, you keep thinking the room is still warm until you look down at your hands and notice they've been numb for a while. Small things at first. She'd make plans, a dinner, a visit somewhere, a weekend away, without telling me, then show a flash of irritation when I hadn't already worked around them. She'd introduce me at her friends' gatherings and then immediately turn away to talk to someone else, leaving me standing slightly off-center, holding a drink I didn't particularly want, with nothing to do but look like I belonged somewhere I was only barely present in. She'd say things in that measured, observational tone she had, the one that sounded like she was simply noting facts about the world, like, "I just wish you were a bit more driven," or, "You're comfortable. That's not a bad thing. It's just comfortable." Or, one evening when I'd mentioned I was passed over for a project at work, "Maybe if you pushed harder for things, they'd go differently." None of it was screaming. None of it was cruel in the way that would have been easy to name. It was the kind of low-grade diminishment that presents itself as honesty, as concern, as someone who just sees you clearly and wants better for you. And because I believed, for a long time, that she genuinely did see me clearly, that her sharpness was turned toward me the way sunlight can be, warmingly, I let those comments land without pushing back. I told myself every long-term relationship has rough patches. I told myself comfort was something to work through, not a permanent state. I told myself the distance I was feeling was something I probably had some part in creating. I kept telling myself things. That was the problem. I was so occupied constructing the story where everything made sense and had a solution that I completely stopped noticing what was actually happening. It was somewhere in the second year when the name Callum started appearing. Callum from her office. A project Callum was leading. Something Callum had said that was apparently very funny. Callum's opinion on something they'd been discussing at a team meeting. I noticed the name the way you notice a sound that keeps repeating, not alarming at first, just present, then increasingly present, and then present enough that you start listening for it. I mentioned it once. Casually. We were washing dishes after dinner, and I said, "You mention Callum a lot. Is he a close friend, or just a work friend?" She looked at me sideways over the running tap. "He's a colleague. Don't make it weird." And I backed off. The way I always backed off. She had this way of responding to anything that made her uncomfortable, not with anger, not with denial, but with a sort of light contempt that made the question itself feel like the problem. Like by asking, I was the one doing something wrong. And because I didn't want to be the one doing something wrong, I let it go. I filed it somewhere quietly. Told myself it was nothing. Told myself I was just being insecure. I wonder now how many things I filed away in that space. I wonder how full that space got before I stopped checking it. The third year was the one where the silence moved in. Not dramatic silence. Not Cold War silence. Just the ordinary, domestic kind of silence where two people stop filling the space between them and eventually stop noticing that they're not. We'd eat dinner at opposite ends of the couch. The television was always on, not because either of us was particularly interested in whatever was playing, but because it filled the room with noise that excused us from filling it with conversation. She was on her phone most evenings. Not hiding it. Not being secretive about it. Just elsewhere. Smiling at the screen sometimes. Not sharing what she was smiling at. And I'd look at her and think, we used to talk for 3 hours straight without noticing the time. And then I'd look back at my own screen and not say that. And the evening would pass. And we'd go to sleep. And do it again the next day. I tried sometimes. I'd put my phone down and ask about her day and she'd answer in short, completed sentences that didn't invite follow-up. Or I'd mention something interesting that had happened at work and she'd nod in the distracted way that means someone is listening to the sound of your voice without registering its content. And I'd finish my sentence and wait. And nothing would come back. And I'd pick up my phone again. And another evening would pass. I told myself this was what happened in long relationships. That the initial intensity settles. That sustained comfort is actually a form of intimacy most people never achieve. I had a lot of theories. They were all ways of not saying the obvious thing. The obvious thing was, she had stopped being interested in me. Not in a dramatic, sudden way. More like interest that recedes so gradually, you only notice when you look back and try to find the last moment it was clearly there and can't locate it. I threw myself into work partly because work was where I still felt like I was actually somewhere. I'd been at a logistics firm for 3 years. I'd moved up modestly but steadily. My direct supervisor was a man named Philip, methodical, plain-spoken, someone who had no tolerance for excuses and almost infinite patience for honest effort. He'd started bringing me into bigger planning discussions, not because I'd lobbied for it, just because he'd watched me work long enough to decide I could handle more. I was learning things I didn't even know I wanted to learn. Supply chain architecture, cross-team coordination, The way large systems fail quietly before they fail loudly, and how to read the early signs. At home, I never talked about any of it. She'd made clear early on that logistics wasn't interesting to her. And I'd respected that. The way you respect someone's preferences without asking whether respecting them is actually costing you something. It was costing me something. I know that now. Not because she should have been fascinated by freight routing, but because the person who loves you should want to know what makes you light up, even if the subject itself doesn't interest them. She didn't want to know, and I'd stopped trying to tell her. And then the kitchen. That Tuesday, 9 p.m., arms crossed. That flat voice. You should be grateful I stayed this long with you. I've turned those words over so many times. Not to hurt myself. More the way you turn over something you found in a drawer, trying to understand what it is and why you kept it. The word grateful keeps stopping me. Grateful. Like endurance is a gift. Like the act of remaining in something. Even half-heartedly. Even while already somewhere else in every way that matters. Is something the other person owes you for. Like love is a ledger. And she'd been tallying it the whole time. And she decided the balance wasn't in her favor. And she wanted me to know she'd noticed before she closed the account. I waited for the anger. I waited for it with genuine curiosity, because I'd always assumed that when something like this finally happened I would feel rage. Hot, immediate, clarifying rage. What came instead was something I didn't have a name for at the time. It was quiet. It was almost hollow. Like the moment after a sound stops, and you realize you'd gotten so used to hearing it that the silence is actually startling. Oh, so that's what this was. That's the shape of what's been here. I think we want different things, she said, when I still hadn't responded. The second line in a script she'd prepared. The kind of thing people say when the decision is already made and the conversation is just a courtesy being performed for someone else's benefit, or, more likely, to preserve their own story of themselves as someone who tried. Is there someone else? I asked. Steady voice. Not accusatory. Just a question I needed answered. She didn't answer it right away. That gap, that 2-second gap, was its own answer. It's not about that, she said finally. Which is a sentence that means, it is exactly about that. But I want the version of this story where I'm the one being honest about my feelings rather than the one who was already somewhere else before I left. I looked at her. I said, okay. Just that. She looked almost annoyed. I could see it. A flicker of frustration that I wasn't making this harder for her. Like she'd prepared for a scene and I was refusing to read my lines. I wasn't being strategic. I wasn't playing cool. I was just done in a way I hadn't fully understood until that exact moment. The way you're done when you finally say out loud the thing you've been quietly knowing for a long time, and the saying of it doesn't change anything. It just makes the knowing official. She moved out over the following 2 weeks. Her things disappeared in increments. A box here, 2 bags there. The bookshelf cleared in sections over several evenings. I let her come and go without drama. I helped her carry the heavy things to the elevator. The couch, which had been hers originally. The large mirror from the hallway. She kept looking at me sideways when I helped. Not with gratitude exactly. With something more like suspicion. Like she was trying to find the catch. On the final day, she stood in the doorway with the last small box, looking at the empty spaces on the walls where things had been. She stood there long enough that I knew she was waiting for something. A plea maybe. An expression of loss. Something that confirmed she was leaving behind something that needed her. I looked at her across the room. Take care of yourself, I said. She held my gaze for a second. Then she left. The door shut. I stood in the apartment by myself and listened to the specific silence of a space that had just been emptied of someone, and I waited to feel what I expected to feel. After about 10 minutes, I went into the kitchen, made coffee, stood at the window that got the afternoon sun, drank the coffee. That was it. That was the ending of 4 years. A cup of coffee and a window. And I'm not telling you that to sound cold. I'm telling you that because there's a version of grief that doesn't feel like grief at the time. It feels like stillness. And you don't realize until much later that the stillness was actually the first real breath you'd taken in a very long time. I won't pretend the first 2 weeks were easy. They weren't. Not in the way people expect. Not obsessive grief. Not midnight calls. Not checking her social media every 20 minutes. More a kind of disorientation. I'd lived inside a particular story about myself for 4 years. The story where I was in a serious relationship. The story where things were mostly okay, just going through a rough patch. The story where I was someone who had made this work and would continue to make it work. All those stories fell away at once, and walking around without them was strange. Like muscle memory for a room that no longer has the same furniture. You reach for the light switch in the same place, and your hand finds a wall. By the third week, something else was starting. Not happiness exactly. More like space. Like the apartment, which had felt small when we were both in it, had suddenly become the right size. I started leaving books face down on the kitchen counter while I cooked. I started playing music I'd gradually stopped playing because she'd had opinions about it, and I'd accommodated those opinions without ever deciding to. I rearranged the bedroom furniture on a Tuesday afternoon for no reason except that I wanted to. Small things. Trivial things. But each one felt like something being returned to me. And the returns were coming in quietly, one small thing at a time, until I had almost a full inventory of a person I'd mislaid somewhere around year 2. I found his taste in music first, then his habit of reading while eating, which she'd called antisocial, then his tendency to call his brother at odd hours just to check in, which had always gotten slightly in the way of her evenings. Then, and this took longer, his instinct to trust himself. That one had been buried the deepest. That one needed the most time. Philip noticed before I said anything. About 3 weeks after she'd left, he pulled me aside after a standing meeting and said, in the direct way he had of saying everything, "You seem clearer lately." Something shift. I thought about giving him a non-answer. Then I said, "My relationship ended." He nodded once. Unhurried. "Funny how that goes sometimes," he said, and walked off. That was it. No, I'm sorry. No, are you okay? No performance of concern. Just a man who understood that sometimes an ending is also a door. He was right. I came back to that proposal I'd been sitting on for 3 months, a restructuring of our northern distribution flow that I'd mapped out in detail, but kept pulling back from presenting because I wasn't sure enough of myself to put it in a room. I wasn't sure enough of myself because I'd spent a long time being made to feel that I wasn't quite enough. That comfortable was another word for insufficient. That I needed to try harder, but was also probably not someone who could pull off harder. That dichotomy, push harder but don't expect too much, is a particular kind of cruelty. It's a loop with no exit. You fail if you try because you're reaching above yourself. You fail if you don't try because you're not ambitious enough. And the person setting the terms of the loop gets to keep moving the goalposts without ever acknowledging what they're doing. I'd been running that loop for 2 years. I just hadn't named it until it wasn't there anymore. I finished the proposal in 11 days. Cleaned it up. Walked into Philip's office and said, "I'd like to present something." He listened without interrupting for 20 minutes. At the end he said, "Leave that with me." A month later, they approved it. I was leading a team of 9 people on a project that had come entirely from my own head. I was 28 years old, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was actually standing at my full height. I should tell you about Callum now. I know you've been waiting. Here's what I actually knew at the time she left. His name, his general existence, and the feeling in my gut that had been filing itself away for over a year. Here's what I found out 6 weeks after the breakup, over drinks with a mutual friend named Tobias who'd been carrying the guilt of knowing and finally decided that carrying it wasn't fair to either of us. Callum hadn't been just a colleague for a while, probably for somewhere around 2 months before she left me, maybe more. Tobias wasn't certain of the exact timeline and said so, but the gist was clear. The late evenings on her phone were Callum. The slight change in her voice when she said his name was Callum. The growing distance between us, which I had diligently tried to bridge, rearranging myself to fit into the narrowing space she'd left, had partly been made narrower on purpose. I sat with that for a while. Tobias watched me, and I could tell he wasn't sure if he'd done the right thing by telling me. I told him he had. What I felt wasn't the explosion of fury I'd have expected. It was that hollow recognition again. Oh, so it was real. So those months of feeling like I was reading the room wrong. I wasn't. I was reading the room exactly right. I just kept correcting myself out of it. That's the thing about staying in something past the point where it makes sense. You don't just lose time. You lose your ability to trust your own perception. You start treating your instincts like enemy signals. And you start constructing elaborate internal arguments for why the thing you're sensing isn't real. I'd done that for the better part of a year. Every time the name came up with that specific frequency. Every time the phone lit up at odd hours, and she tilted it slightly away. Every time I asked a direct question and received an answer that was technically accurate, but pointed in a direction designed to make me feel like the problem. I'd filed every one of those things neatly away. Told myself I was imagining. Told myself I was insecure. Told myself that in good relationships you trust the other person, and distrust is a personal failing, not a response to actual evidence. That's the most insidious thing about being gaslit, even gently. It doesn't always come with a raised voice or a cruel word. Sometimes it's just someone consistently framing your accurate perception as a character flaw. And if you hear that framing enough times, you start to believe it. And the trust you lose isn't trust in them. It's trust in yourself. That was the most expensive cost of all. And that was the most important thing I got back. Not the project, not the promotion, not the recognition. The ability to trust what I could plainly see. That was the thing worth building from. I looked at her social media once, about 2 months after she'd moved out. I want to be honest about that. I didn't delete her number without looking. I looked. She and Callum were posting together. Trips out of the city. Restaurant photos with that very particular composition of plates artfully arranged and faces partially cropped. There was an energy to it, the kind that reads less like happiness and more like look how happy we are. I'm not being uncharitable. I know what that energy feels like because I've also done things for an audience. I looked at it for maybe 4 minutes, closed the app, and I made a decision in that moment that I've never regretted. I was done consuming that story, not because it hurt too much, because it didn't hurt enough to be worth the time it would cost me. She was someone I used to know. She was living a life I would not have been good in, and that would not have been good for me. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and neither of them required my attention. Months 4 and 5 were the ones where things compounded. The project was delivering results ahead of schedule. Philip took me into a regional strategy meeting, the kind I'd previously watched from outside the door, metaphorically speaking, and I sat at a long table with people who had decades on me, and I held my ground. Not aggressively, not by talking over anyone, just by knowing what I was talking about. There's a specific confidence that comes from having actually done the work, not performed it, done it. And people who've done things themselves can feel when someone else has too. I noticed it in the way the conversation would pause at my input rather than flow past it. In the way Philip would catch my eye after I made a point, not to approve it, but just to acknowledge it landed. Small things, but they accumulate. And after a long stretch of a life where your input felt like it barely made a dent, where your enthusiasm hit a wall of mild indifference and slid down it, having your words actually land somewhere felt like a recalibration of something fundamental. I started trusting my own read on things again. Not arrogantly, just steadily. The way you trust a compass when it's been reliable long enough. Outside of work, I was also doing something I hadn't done properly in years. I was being a person. 3 runs a week, early mornings, the kind of habit that starts as discipline and becomes something you actually want. Real cooking, reading again, full books, cover to cover, not just the first 3 chapters of 6 different things. Calling my brother on Sunday evenings. Meeting Theo for dinner. Theo, who I'd met in university and who I'd gradually seen less and less of because she'd found him too loud, and I'd accommodated that judgment without ever questioning it. We had dinner at a small Italian place near his new apartment, and we talked for 3 hours. Over dessert, he said, "You seem like yourself again." I asked him what he meant. He thought about it. "When you were with her," he said, "you had this habit. Before you said anything at all, even just an opinion about a film or something, you'd pause, like you were checking it was safe to say, like you'd gotten used to things being used against you. You don't do that anymore." I didn't know what to say. I just sat with it all the way home, checking if it was safe. I had known I was doing it, but I knew immediately that he was right. For years of having opinions quietly redirected, for years of enthusiasm slightly deflated, for years of being graded and coming in just below passing. And it had sunk in so gradually that I'd started doing it to myself, preemptively diminishing my own voice so she couldn't do it first. The worst part wasn't that she'd done it. The worst part was how efficiently I'd learned to do it on her behalf, even when she wasn't in the room, even when she was nowhere near me, even alone at work, presenting to a room full of people who had no opinion about me one way or another. I'd been preemptively softening everything, walking in slightly apologetically, framing ideas as possibilities rather than positions, pulling back from conviction at the last second. Theo had noticed. Philip had noticed. The only person who hadn't fully noticed was me. That's what 4 years inside the wrong story will do. It rewires the defaults. Tobias sent the first screenshot around month 5. He prefaced it with, "I don't know if you want to see this, but I thought you should." It was a post from her profile. One of those quote cards, soft neutral background, clean white font, with a line about people who leave when things get difficult. Something about finally understanding your own worth. Something about how the people who wrote you off will one day realize what they lost. I read it twice. Set the phone down. Picked it up again. Read it a 3rd time. And I had to be very careful with myself in that moment. Because the easy thing, the satisfying, petty, human thing would have been to feel righteous about it. She's posting about being left. She left me. She's posting about not being valued. She's the one who said I should be grateful. And all of that is true. But I've spent enough time being around people who are in pain to know what those posts actually are. They're not messages to anyone specific. They're not performances for the person they're nominally directed at. They're a conversation someone is having with themselves when they're not yet ready to have it without an audience. She wasn't doing well. That was what the post actually said. And I sat with that. Not with satisfaction. With something closer to sadness. Not the sad for me kind. The other kind. I went for a run. Came back. Made dinner. Called my brother. Slept well. That was what it looked like. That was the whole thing. No reply. No dramatic gesture. No screenshot sent to mutual friends. Just a man who had places to be and things to build in a life that was asking him to show up for it. I showed up. At month 6, the company opened a regional director position. Philip told me he was putting my name forward. I want to be honest, I didn't get it. Not that round. The person who got it had 12 more years of experience, which is an objective gap I couldn't close by trying harder. But I came second out of a short list of 7. Philip told me the decision had been close. Close. At 28. 9 months out of a relationship that had made me feel like someone who should be grateful someone had bothered to stay. Second and 7 for a regional directorship. I went home and sat in my kitchen and stared at nothing for a while. Not because I was gutted about not getting it. Just because something about the distance between those two versions of myself. The one who stood in that same kitchen being told to be grateful, and the one who had just almost become a regional director at 28, was so stark that I needed a minute to just let it exist. I made tea. Went to bed. Lay there thinking about how long I'd been quietly building something in the dark. Tobias came through again at month 7. Different kind of post this time. A photo. Her. Alone. A coastal trip. Gray water. Low sky. The kind of scene people choose when they want to look contemplative and introspective rather than sad, but the sadness finds its way into the frame regardless. The caption was something about learning to be yourself again. About new beginnings and hard lessons. No Callum in the photo. No tag. No mention. I noticed that. I noticed the way her friends' comments were doing the work of rebuilding something in her that sounded like it had taken a hit. You deserve everything. So proud of how far you've come. You're so strong. I set the phone down. I didn't feel smug. I want to be honest about that, because this is the part where people expect the smug. What I felt was something more complicated. A kind of grief-adjacent thing. Not for me. Not for the relationship. But for the fact that someone can do real damage to another person while carrying so much of their own unexamined damage that they never fully see what they've done. She'd said I should be grateful. She'd been talking to Callum. She'd left. And now she was at the coast alone posting about hard lessons. And somewhere in all of that was a real person who was probably hurting and probably didn't fully understand why and probably hadn't fully reckoned with her part in anything. I'm not excusing it. I'm just saying that understanding something and excusing it are two different things, and you can hold one without the other. Tobias, because he is exactly who he is, had one more for me at month 8. He opened with, "Last one, I swear, but I think you genuinely need to see this one." He was right. He was also right that it would be the last one, because after this one I'd have everything I needed and nothing left to look for. She and Callum had ended. He didn't know the specifics. Just that it was over. She'd moved back to her own place, and the mutual acquaintance who told him had described her as going through something. I put my phone face down on the table, and a specific memory arrived without being invited. That kitchen. That Tuesday. Her arms crossed. That flat, practiced voice. "You should be grateful I stayed this long with you." And I sat there quietly wondering, not with satisfaction, not with cruelty, just with genuine human curiosity, whether Callum had heard something like that eventually. Whether he'd stood in his own kitchen with his own version of that particular hollowness. I hoped he was all right. I meant that plainly. And then I moved on, because it was officially no longer my story. Let me tell you about the moment I actually understood that my life had changed. Not a headline. Not a milestone. Just an ordinary Tuesday morning. Tuesdays keep showing up in this story, and I have no explanation for that. About 9 months after she'd left. I was making breakfast. Proper breakfast. Eggs in one pan. Toast in the toaster, coffee already brewing. Music on. The specific playlist I'd quietly stopped using because she'd called it depressing and I'd accommodated that so completely I'd forgotten I'd done it. The apartment was tidy the way I'd made it tidy, not the tidy of compromise. A book was face down on the counter from where I'd been reading over dinner the night before. My running shoes were by the door, still slightly damp from the morning's run. I stood at the hob stirring eggs at 7:35 in the morning, and I realized I felt good. Not good because something exciting had happened. Not good because I was performing well at something, or had been recognized, or had won something. Good in the way that's just a baseline. Good the way a room is warm when the heat is on. Not a special occasion, not a surprise, just the ordinary temperature of a space that's being properly maintained. I tried to remember the last time that was just the default setting. The ordinary register. I tried to reach back through 4 years for a morning that felt like this. I couldn't find one. Every morning had carried something. An ambient adjustment. A reading of the room before I'd even left the bedroom. A slight bracing against whatever the day might require from me in terms of managing her mood, her expectations, her quiet corrections. I hadn't known I was bracing. I'd just been doing it so long it had become invisible. And now I was standing in my kitchen and the eggs were fine and the music was right, and there was no room to read and no mood to manage, and the only expectation in the apartment was the one I'd set for myself. And that expectation was just, show up, be yourself, see what you can build. I ate breakfast at the kitchen table, read for 20 minutes, left for work. That was all. But that was actually everything. She messaged at month 10. No preamble, no softening line. Just, can we talk sometime? I read it several times. Not in anguish, just thinking. I thought about who I would have been at month 2 or 3. I would have replied within minutes. I would have asked what she needed. Part of me, and I'm being honest because this is how people work, would have hoped, not for a reconciliation, just for the version of things where she acknowledged something real, where the ledger got corrected, where you should be grateful I stayed got replaced by something that recognized what had actually happened. But I wasn't at month 2. I was at month 10. And at month 10, I understood something I didn't at month 2. The acknowledgement wasn't coming. Not because she was a monster, but because people who do the things she did, who stay in something while already gone, who use their contempt as currency, who leave while positioning themselves as the one who was wronged, those people rarely circle back with clarity. They circle back because they're uncomfortable, because things didn't go the way they expected, because silence from the person you've assigned a particular role to is unsettling when that role was the one who needed me. I wasn't that anymore. And her message wasn't an apology looking for an opening. It was a question looking for reassurance. I put the phone down, made coffee, thought about it long enough to be sure, picked the phone back up. I don't think that would be good for either of us. Take care. Sent. Blocked. No anger. No monologue. No satisfaction I could identify. Just a door being shut cleanly on something that had already been over for a long time. And I want to be clear about what blocking someone means and doesn't mean. It doesn't mean you hate them. It doesn't mean you're afraid of what seeing them might do to you. It doesn't mean you're weak or petty or unable to handle a conversation. It means you've looked clearly at what a conversation would cost you, and at what it would produce, and at whether the production justifies the cost. And you've decided it doesn't. That's not cruelty. That's just maturity wearing the face of a boundary. She didn't need access to me to process whatever she was processing. She had people for that. And I didn't need the conversation she was inviting me into. The one that would be about her feelings and her journey and her understanding of what happened, with me in the role of validating audience. I played that role for 4 years. The run was over. The next day I went to work, ran my team meeting, ate lunch at my desk while reading something that had nothing to do with any of it. And by evening it was just another Tuesday. The kind you don't remember because nothing marked it. The kind that is only important in retrospect, when you understand that ordinary Tuesdays are the whole texture of a life. And the life you're living on them is either one you chose or one that happened to you while you were busy adjusting. I was choosing now. Every Tuesday. The regional director position came open again at the 18-month mark. Different panel this time. Larger scope. I prepared for 6 weeks. Not anxiously. Just thoroughly. The way you prepare for something when you're not trying to prove yourself to anyone but yourself. I walked into that room and I knew my material cold. I answered the questions directly, and when I didn't know something I said so and explained how I'd approach finding out. I didn't apologize for anything before I said it. I didn't check if it was safe first. I came out of that room and waited 2 weeks. Philip called me into his office on a Thursday afternoon and said 2 words. You got it. I stood there for a second. He watched me with that dry patience he has. Told you, he added. That was his celebration. I walked back to my desk, sat down, stared at my screen for about 30 seconds, thought about the kitchen, about the words, about grateful, About the man who had stood there and absorbed those words and said nothing, and then quietly spent the next 18 months building something that nobody, including himself, had fully predicted. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just went back to work. Because there was still work to do. There always is. A year after that, I met someone. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, because she deserves more than to be a supporting character in a story that belongs to a different chapter of my life. What I'll say is simple. The first time I told her about a project I was proud of, something that had been hard and taken months, and had finally come together, she put down what she was doing. She looked at me. She said, "Tell me more. I want to understand the whole thing." I sat there for a second longer than was probably natural, because I was waiting for the slight deflation. That's good. The conversation moving on without landing. It didn't come. She actually wanted to know. She asked follow-up questions. She got genuinely interested in a part of it I hadn't expected to be interesting to anyone outside the work. I didn't tell her, that night, why that hit me the way it did. Some things you carry quietly for a while before you share them. But I drove home thinking about how strange it was that the simple act of someone actually listening had felt like receiving something remarkable, and how that probably said everything about what I'd been used to, and how it also said everything about how much the default had shifted. Tobias, being exactly himself, sent one final screenshot a little over a year after the breakup. He said, "Last one, I genuinely promise. I think you'll be glad to see it." It was her profile, a photo she'd posted. She was smiling. Not the curated smile of the coast trip, not the performance smile of the restaurant photos with Callum. A real smile. She was somewhere outdoors, bright day, hair a bit windswept, looking at whoever was behind the camera like they'd just said something that surprised her into happiness. She looked lighter than I'd ever seen her in the later years of our time together. The caption was simple. Something about being in a good place. No quotes. No subtext. Just a woman who appeared to be finding some version of herself that wasn't performing anything for anyone. I looked at it for a while, and I'm going to tell you something that might feel unexpected. I was genuinely glad. Not for complicated reasons. Not because it confirmed something. Not because I was relieved she'd moved on so I could too. I'd moved on at month 1. Just the plain, simple gladness you feel when a person you once loved appears to be okay. Even when the path that got both of you here involved pain. Even when they said things they shouldn't have. Even when they handled things badly. People are carrying things. Always. She was carrying something I didn't fully see while I was inside it, and something I don't fully understand even now. And whatever that was, the need to diminish, the contempt dressed up as honesty, the ledger she was keeping, the grateful, it came from somewhere that had nothing to do with me being insufficient. It had to do with her. It always had. And that's not a gift I'm giving her. It's just a fact I can hold without it being heavy. She hurt me. I didn't deserve it. And she's a person with her own unresolved things who did it anyway. All 3 of those sentences are true at once. I thought about all of this recently, on an ordinary Sunday morning. I was out on my usual route, early, at the hour when the light is doing that specific, generous thing it does before the day fully decides to begin. No reason for her to come to mind. No trigger. Just the mind doing what minds do. Surfacing the past sometimes without asking permission. I thought about that kitchen. The Tuesday, 9 p.m. Those 10 words. You should be grateful I stayed this long with you. And I ran with it for a while. And here's where I landed, somewhere around the halfway point of the route. She was right. Not in the way she meant. Not because I owed her. Not because she'd given me something I couldn't have found without her. But because if she hadn't said it, if she hadn't made it that clear, that cold, that final, I would have kept going. I know myself well enough to know that. I would have kept adjusting. Kept shrinking into the available space. Kept telling myself I was almost happy and almost was close enough. She pushed me out of a story I'd been quietly suffocating inside. She did it for her own reasons. She did it without grace. She did it while already halfway out the door with someone else. But she did it. And the version of me that walked out of that kitchen that Tuesday night, the one who made coffee instead of begging, who helped carry furniture instead of bargaining, who said take care instead of please don't go, that version had already started becoming someone neither of us had fully anticipated. Sometimes the most important redirects in a life don't come with clarity. They come with contempt. They come with words designed to diminish. And the choice you make in the silence that follows, whether to collapse into those words or to stand very quietly in them until you realize they say more about the person who said them than they will ever say about you. That choice is the whole thing. That choice is the entire story. I chose to stand. Not heroically. Not consciously, even. Just stubbornly. The way a person stands when they've finally run out of the energy it takes to fold themselves smaller. And sometimes that's all it takes. Sometimes the most important thing you do is simply refuse to be reduced. And sometimes refusing to be reduced is enough to change absolutely everything. I kept my pace. Finished the route. Came home to the apartment that felt exactly the right size. Took off my running shoes. Made breakfast. Played my music. Stood at the kitchen window with the coffee. And felt that baseline. That steady, quiet, unperformed good. The ordinary temperature of a life that belonged entirely to me. She posted sad quotes. I built a life. One of those things required an audience. The other one didn't.